The Alpha King rejected every woman until his best friend's sister walked away crying and
Sire,
he,
do not
R-E-A-L-I-Z-E-D,
pursue
he
her.
loved her. She shouldn't have come tonight. Alessia knew that the moment she stepped through the grand doors of the Blood Moon Gala and felt every eye in the room slide over her like she was furniture. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. She was Mateo's little sister, the beta's quiet shadow, the girl who wore borrowed dresses and stood in corners and smiled politely when powerful people looked through her instead of at her. But she had come anyway. The gown she wore was pale silver, simple and clean against the sea of silk and jewels that filled the great hall. No embroidery, no pearls sewn into the hem, just a soft fabric that skimmed her collarbone and made her feel, for one single foolish moment standing in front of her mirror at home, like maybe she could belong somewhere like this. The noblewomen, near the entrance, had noticed immediately. She heard them before she saw them. Two of them, standing close together with crystal glasses tilted toward their lips, voices low but not low enough. "Is that the beta's sister?" "I think so. Poor thing, that dress is practically a nightgown." Soft laughter, the kind that was designed to carry. Alessia had kept her chin up and walked past them. She was good at that. She had been practicing that particular skill her entire life. The hall was enormous. Hundreds of candles burned in iron chandeliers above, throwing warm gold light across the faces of pack nobles, allied alphas, high-born daughters presented like offerings at the feet of a king who had never once looked interested. The Blood Moon Gala happened once a year. It was tradition. It was spectacle. And at the center of it all, seated at the far end of the hall on a raised dais like something carved from stone, was Alpha King Kalen. Alessia made herself not look at him right away. She had a rule about that. Look too quickly and her whole evening would unravel. So she took a glass of something from a passing tray, pressed the cool crystal against her palm, and let herself look at the room first. The long tables draped in burgundy cloth. The musicians in the far corner playing something low and aching. The clusters of people laughing too loud, performing their joy for anyone important enough to notice. Then she let herself look at him. He was exactly what he always was, devastating. Kalen sat with the particular stillness of a man who had never once needed to perform for a room, because every room already belonged to him. Dark hair, sharp jaw, shoulders that filled his ceremonial coat like the fabric had been stitched directly onto his body. His expression was what it always was, unreadable, cold, and so unbothered it crossed the line into something that almost looked like contempt. He was not watching the dancing. He was not laughing with the men beside him. He held a glass of dark wine and stared at the middle distance like the entire celebration was a minor inconvenience he had agreed to endure. 3 years. Alessia had loved him quietly for 3 years. She had told herself 100 different times that it was nothing, that it was proximity, that it was just the natural, stupid consequence of watching a powerful man be decent to her brother and occasionally nod in her direction when she passed him in the hall. She had tried, twice, to redirect that feeling toward other men. Softer men. Men who actually smiled at her and asked her questions about herself and remembered her answers. It hadn't worked. Because her heart, infuriatingly and without her permission, had already decided. She was still watching him when it started. A woman approached the dais, beautiful in the way that women chosen for kings were always beautiful, calculated and deliberate, every curl and jewel placed to catch the light. She was the daughter of a high-ranking alpha from the Northern Territories, and the way she moved made it clear she had been rehearsing this moment. Alessia watched her present herself with a low, graceful curtsy. She watched the woman lift her eyes to Kalen with practiced warmth. She watched Kalen listen to whatever the woman said, his face never shifting, his posture never opening. And then she watched him speak. She couldn't hear the words from where she stood, but she didn't need to. The woman's face said everything. The color that drained from her cheeks, the fractional flinch around her eyes, the way she straightened too fast and turned away with the smile still plastered on her face, walking back through the crowd in the particular rigid way of someone trying not to cry in public. The Alpha King had rejected her, just like he rejected them all. Alessia took a long sip from her glass and told herself to go home. She told herself clearly, in plain, simple words inside her own head. Go home, Alessia. Get your wrap from the cloakroom. Walk back through those grand doors. Go back to your small house and your quiet life and stop torturing yourself. She finished the glass. She did not go home. Instead, something that had been building in her chest for 3 years, something quiet and compressed and exhausted from being quiet, pushed against her ribs until she couldn't breathe around it. She thought about every hallway she had stepped back in, every room she had made herself smaller in, every time she had swallowed whatever was rising in her throat because it wasn't her place. It wasn't the right moment. It wasn't going to change anything anyway. She thought about waking up tomorrow exactly the same. And then her feet were moving. She didn't plan it. She would think about that later, in the dark, for a very long time. She didn't plan the walk across the hall. She didn't plan the way the crowd seemed to part slightly as she moved, maybe because her face had shifted into something unfamiliar, something that looked like resolve, and people unconsciously make way for resolve even when they can't name what they're seeing. She stopped at the foot of the dais. Kalen's eyes moved to her. They always moved slowly, his eyes, like he had all the time in the world and the world could wait. Her hands were shaking. She pressed her fingers together at her sides so he wouldn't see. I need to say something, she said. Her voice was steady. She was genuinely surprised by that. Kalen said nothing. He simply looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. Around them, the nearest conversations had started to quiet. People were beginning to turn. I have been in love with you, Alessia said, for 3 years. The words landed in the air and stayed there. She heard someone nearby draw a sharp breath. She did not look away from Kalen. I know what you are, she continued, and her voice only broke slightly on the next part, just slightly. I know you don't do this. I know you don't feel things. Or maybe you do and you just decided a long time ago that it wasn't worth it. But I needed you to know. I needed to say it once out loud so it stops living in my chest and making me smaller every single day. Silence. Kalen set his wine glass down. He stood slowly. He was so much taller standing. The candlelight carved shadows across his face that made him look like something ancient and unmovable. Alessia, his voice was quiet, but the hall had gone quiet enough that it carried. She waited. You are my beta's sister, he said, and the way he said it was not cruel in its tone. It was worse than cruel. It was final. It was the voice of a man closing a door that had never actually been open. What you're feeling is misplaced admiration, nothing more. I will not insult Mateo's loyalty by entertaining this. The air left her body. This conversation ends here, Kalen said, and it doesn't happen again. He sat back down. He picked up his wine glass. And the room, because the room always followed what the king did, slowly, terribly, began to breathe again. Conversations restarted. Someone laughed somewhere. The musicians, who had let their song trail into nothing without realizing it, picked the melody back up. Alessia stood there for one more second, just one. Then she turned around and walked back through the hall. She kept her chin up. She was good at that. She walked past the noblewomen near the entrance who had gone very still and were watching her with something between pity and satisfaction. She walked through the grand doors without collecting her wrap. The night air hit her skin like cold water, and she kept walking, down the stone steps, across the torchlit courtyard, past the guards who stepped aside without a word. She did not cry until she reached the tree line beyond the estate walls. She walked into the dark between the trees, and she pressed her back against the rough bark of the largest one, and she slid down it until she was sitting on the cold ground in her borrowed silver dress. And she cried the way people cry when they have been holding something for too long, silently at first, then not silently at all. She stayed there until the cold got into her bones. Then she stood up, brushed the bark and dirt from her gown, and made a decision. She was done. Not from anger, not from bitterness, just from exhaustion. She was done being the woman who loved someone who couldn't see her. She was done making herself small in hallways and rooms and crowds. She was going to go home, pack what mattered, and leave this territory before she became someone she didn't recognize. She pulled her pack bond up in her mind, that invisible thread that connected every wolf to their alpha, and she severed it. It hurt, like pulling a stitch from a healing wound. Then it was gone, and she was free. Behind her, through the walls and the music and the candlelight and the crowd, in the great hall of the Blood Moon Gala, Alpha King Kalen reached for his wine glass. And stopped. Something moved behind his ribs. Not a thought, not a decision. Something older and deeper and entirely without his permission, a feeling he had not let himself have in so long that he almost didn't recognize what it was. He looked toward the grand doors. They were closed. He looked back at his wine glass. He set it down again. And for the first time in a very long time, the Alpha King of the most powerful pack on the continent sat in the middle of a room full of people, and felt, in the quiet place behind everything he had built to protect himself, completely and utterly alone. Chapter 2. 3 days. That was how long Alesha had been gone. 3 days, and Kalen had not slept. Not really. He had sat in his chair by the window of his private chamber and drifted in and out of something that wasn't rest, something that felt more like drowning slowly in shallow water. Every time his eyes closed, his wolf surged forward and he jerked awake with his hands gripping the armrests hard enough to leave marks in the wood. Something was wrong with him. He knew it. He could feel it the way you feel a fever coming before the heat actually arrives. That low, deep wrongness sitting in the center of your chest. His wolf, the part of him that was ancient and instinctive, and did not care at all about politics or protocol or the careful architecture of his emotional control, was in a state he had never experienced before. It was not anger. He knew anger. Anger was clean and directed and useful. This was grief. Raw animal grief, and it made no sense to him, which made it worse. On the morning of the 4th day, Mateo walked into his study without knocking. That alone told Kalen everything about where they stood. Mateo had been his beta for 9 years. In 9 years, the man had never once entered a room without knocking. He was the most disciplined, most loyal, most controlled person Kalen had ever known. The fact that he walked in now with his knuckles white at his sides and his jaw set like stone told Kalen that whatever was about to happen was not going to be a conversation between a king and his beta. It was going to be something much older than that. "She's gone," Mateo said. His voice was flat, not quiet the way calm is quiet. Quiet the way a field goes quiet right before lightning hits it. "I know," Kalen said. "She severed her pack bond the same night." Mateo stopped in the middle of the room. He didn't sit. "Do you understand what that means? She didn't just leave. She cut herself off. She is out there completely unprotected with no alpha connection in territories that do not care whether she lives or dies." Kalen looked at him. "I know what a severed bond means, Mateo." "Then act like it." The words came out sharp and sudden, and Mateo pulled them back almost immediately, pressing his lips together. A muscle twitched in his jaw. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, but the edge hadn't left it. "She is my sister. She is 23 years old, and she has never once asked for anything from anyone in her entire life. And the one time she asked for something, you destroyed her in front of half the nobility of this continent." The words hit the room and stayed there. Kalen didn't flinch. He had learned a long time ago not to flinch, but something moved behind his eyes. "I did what was necessary," he said. "You did what was easy," Mateo said. "There is a difference." He held Kalen's gaze for a long moment, long enough that it crossed the line between loyal beta and furious older brother. Then he turned and walked back out the door without another word. Kalen sat with the silence he left behind. He told himself Mateo was wrong. He ran the logic of it through his mind the way he always did when emotion tried to cloud his thinking. Alesha was the beta's sister. A connection between them would have been a political liability, a personal complication, a fracture in the most important professional relationship he had. He had done the right thing. He had protected his brotherhood, his pack, his kingdom. He had done the right thing. His wolf howled from somewhere so deep inside him that the sound of it never reached his throat. It stayed there, reverberating in his chest like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. By midday, his council had noticed. not the grief, not the wolf. They noticed the edges of it, the way his focus kept slipping, the 2-second delay before he responded to questions, the fact that he had picked up the same report 3 times in one meeting and read the same paragraph each time without retaining a word of it. His head of council, an older man named Drevin, who had served 2 kings before Kalen, set down his papers at the end of the meeting and looked at him with the particular careful expression of someone choosing their words like they were choosing footing on ice. "My king," Drevin said, "your wolf." "I'm aware," Kalen said. "The pack can feel it, the instability." Drevin paused. "It will spread if it isn't resolved. A destabilized alpha king creates a destabilized pack. You know this." "I said I'm aware." Drevin nodded slowly and left. Kalen pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and sat alone in the council chamber for a long time after everyone had filed out. That evening, his spymaster arrived. Corvin was a small, quiet man who moved like he was always slightly in shadow, even in fully lit rooms. He had served Kalen for 7 years, and in that time he had delivered news of wars, assassinations, border betrayals, and coup attempts. He always delivered difficult information with the same steady, uninflected calm. Tonight he set a single folder on the desk in front of Kalen and did not speak right away. Kalen opened it. The top page was a report dated 8 months ago, one he had never seen. He read the first paragraph and went very still. "Explain this," he said. Corvin explained. The woman who had presented herself to Kalen 2 years prior as his fated mate, a claim Kalen had dismissed and publicly rejected because the bond hadn't felt right, because something in his wolf had refused to accept it, had been a fabrication, a planted deception. An enemy faction operating within his own borders had located a woman whose natural scent profile was close enough to mimic the mate bond under chemical alteration. She had been coached, costumed, and sent in to trigger a false recognition and then publicly rejected, designed to make Kalen appear either heartless or incapable of bonding, undermining his authority with the allied packs who placed enormous cultural weight on the mate bond. Kalen's hands were flat on the desk. "And Alesha," he said. His voice came out very quiet. Corvin turned to the second page. Alesha's scent had been chemically masked, a compound introduced through a common household product. It had been administered gradually, over the course of nearly 2 years, by someone with regular access to the Beta's residence. The masking agent suppressed the fated mate signature completely. From Kalen's wolf's perspective, she had simply been the Beta's sister, a familiar, safe, neutral presence. Not the person his soul had been looking for his entire life. Which she was. Which she had always been. Kalen read the page twice. He read it a 3rd time. The words did not change. He stood up from his desk slowly. He walked to the window. Outside, the territory rolled away in the dark, lit only by the moon, quiet and enormous and indifferent to whatever was currently dismantling him from the inside. His true mate. He had stood in front of his true mate in a room full of people. She had told him she loved him. She had stood there shaking, her hands pressed to her sides, her voice breaking only once and only slightly, and she had told him the truest thing she knew. And he had looked her in the eyes and told her it was nothing, that she was misplaced, that the conversation was over. He had sent her out into the dark. He turned back to Corvin. "Where is she?" Corvin had clearly anticipated this. He turned to the 3rd page without hesitation. Alesha had crossed into the neutral border territories within 24 hours of leaving. She had traveled light and fast and covered her trail well enough to delay his scouts by 2 full days. She was currently located in a border city called Varen, a city that sat at the intersection of 3 pack territories and therefore answered to none of them, a city that operated on its own rules. She was there, the report said, under the protection of Alpha Giovanni. Kalen's vision sharpened. Giovanni was the ruling alpha of the Crest faction, a rival power that had been circling Kalen's borders for years like something patient and hungry. He was not a man who offered protection without extracting a price. He was not a man who did anything for free. "The binding ceremony," Kalen said. He didn't make it a question because he already knew. Corvin nodded. 48 hours, Corvin said. The ceremony is scheduled for the evening of the day after tomorrow at the cathedral sanctuary in the center of Varen. 48 hours. Alessia was going to bind herself to Giovanni in 48 hours. Not from love. Kaelin understood that immediately and completely. She was going to do it the same way she had always navigated a world that hadn't given her enough options. Practically. Quietly. She was going to sacrifice what she wanted in exchange for safety, because somewhere inside herself she had decided that what she wanted wasn't something she was allowed to have. He knew that. He understood it in his bones. Because he had done the same thing his entire life. Something moved through him then. Not grief this time. Something different. Something that started in the place where his wolf lived and moved upward through his whole body until it reached the surface and settled on his face. Determination. He was already moving toward the door when Corvin spoke again. "My king." Corvin's voice carried one note of careful hesitation. Giovanni's territory surrounds Varen on two sides. Entering without invitation is an act of aggression. If you go in alone, without an official delegation, without a diplomatic framework, it could be interpreted as an act of war between the factions. Kaelin pulled his coat from the hook beside the door. "I know," he said. "The political consequences alone could." "I know what the consequences are, Corvin." He opened the door. "Send no one after me," he said. "This is not a king's errand, this is mine." He walked out into the corridor. Behind him, in the quiet study, Corvin looked down at the folder still open on the desk. At the page with Alessia's name on it. At the faint chemical compound notation in the margin that had changed everything. He closed the folder carefully. Outside, somewhere in the territory, Kaelin shifted. Not in the careful, controlled way he always shifted when protocol required it. He shifted the way his wolf had been begging to shift for 4 days, completely and without restraint, and when his paws hit the ground he was already running. He did not look back at the palace lights. He ran toward Varen. He ran toward her. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the alpha king of the most powerful pack on the continent felt something that was not loneliness or control or the cold weight of responsibility. He felt hope, and it terrified him. Chapter 3. The candles in the cathedral were white. Alessia noticed that first. Hundreds of them, tall and perfectly spaced along the stone walls of the sanctuary, burning without a flicker because the air inside was completely still. Everything in this place was still. The flowers arranged along the aisle were pale and formal. The gathered crowd on either side, members of Giovanni's faction and a scattering of neutral territory witnesses, sat with the particular quiet of people attending something significant that they were not entirely sure was joyful. Alessia stood at the back of the cathedral in a white dress that was not hers. It was beautiful. She could acknowledge that objectively. Giovanni had sent it to her rooms that morning with a handwritten note that was courteous and precise and contained no warmth whatsoever. The dress was fitted and elegant, and it felt like wearing someone else's life. She looked down at her hands. They were not shaking. She found that interesting. 4 days ago she had stood at the foot of a dais in a silver dress with her hands pressed to her sides to hide the trembling, saying the truest thing she had ever said out loud, and her whole body had been vibrating with feeling. Now she was standing at the entrance of a cathedral about to bind herself to a man she did not love, and her hands were completely still. That was what happened, she thought, when you ran out of feeling. You didn't become strong, you just became quiet. She had made this decision with a clear head. She needed to believe that. Giovanni had offered her protection, a title, a territory, and immunity from any alpha claim. In exchange, she offered a political alliance and her name on a binding agreement. It was a transaction. It was survival. It was the kind of decision that women in her position had been making for centuries when the world didn't leave them better options. She just hadn't expected it to feel so much like giving up. She took a slow breath and looked toward the altar at the far end of the aisle. Giovanni stood there already, tall and dark-haired and composed, his hands clasped in front of him. He was not an ugly man. He was not even an unkind man, exactly. He was simply a man who treated everything, including her, like a resource to be allocated correctly. He had looked at her and seen leverage. She had looked at him and seen an exit. It was not a love story, but she had stopped believing in those. The doors behind her were still open. She could feel the night air on her bare shoulders. She told herself to walk forward. She was still telling herself that when the doors behind her exploded inward. Not opened, not swung wide. Exploded, both of them, off their iron hinges, stone dust and splinters of ancient wood blasting into the entrance of the cathedral in a crack of sound, so sudden and violent that half the crowd screamed before they even understood what was happening. The candles along the back wall guttered, and some of them went out entirely. And for one long second, the whole cathedral went very still the way it does after a thunderclap, that held breath of shock before the world catches back up with itself. Kalen stood in the ruined doorway. He was bleeding. There was a gash across his left temple that had tracked down the side of his face and dried dark against his jaw. His coat was torn at one shoulder. His hair was wild in the way that happened when someone had been running for hours through terrain that didn't care about them. He was breathing hard, not from fear, but from the particular controlled urgency of a man who had been moving without stopping and had made himself stop only now. His eyes found her immediately. They didn't search the room. They didn't sweep the crowd or clock the exits or assess the threat landscape the way she had watched him do in every formal setting she had ever shared with him. They just went straight to her, like they already knew exactly where she was, like they had always known and had simply been refusing to look. She stopped breathing. Giovanni moved first. He stepped away from the altar, and his voice came out with the flat, dangerous authority of a man who did not tolerate violations of his territory. "You are standing inside my jurisdiction, Kalen, without invitation, without delegation. You understand what that means." "I do," Kalen said. His voice was hoarse, still quiet, still the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "Then you understand I have every right to treat this as an act of aggression." "You do," Kalen said again. He didn't look at Giovanni when he said it. He was still looking at Alessia. She watched something move across Giovanni's face, something that was half fury and half the careful recalculation of a man who had not gotten to where he was by being stupid. He looked between them, between Kalen's face and Alessia's face, and whatever he saw in the space between those two things, he made a decision. He shifted. It happened fast, the way it always happened fast with powerful alphas, one moment a man and the next something enormous and dark and ancient filling the space where the man had been. Giovanni's wolf was massive, deep brown and built like something from a different era, all weight and power and territorial fury. Kalen shifted to meet him. What came next was not a fight the way most people understood fights. It was a collision. It was two apex predators in an enclosed stone space, and the cathedral was not built for it. The first impact took out an entire row of pews on the left side. The second sent a crack running up the wall behind the altar from floor to ceiling. People were scrambling, pressing back against the walls, some running for the side doors, and the white candles were toppling and the flowers were crushed underfoot, and the beautiful, formal, bloodless ceremony that was supposed to happen tonight was disintegrating in real time. Alessia did not run. She stood at the back of the cathedral and watched and could not make herself move. She should have moved. Every rational part of her brain was telling her to move. But she was rooted to the spot by something she couldn't name, watching the most feared alpha on the continent bleed and fight in a destroyed cathedral for a reason she still hadn't fully let herself believe. It ended the way it had to end. Kalen was faster. He had always been faster. She had heard that her whole life, that the Alpha King moved like something that existed slightly ahead of normal time. Giovanni was powerful and furious and fighting on home ground, but Kalen was fighting with something Giovanni was. He was fighting like losing was not something he was willing to do. Not tonight, not for this. Giovanni shifted back to human form. He was breathing hard, a long cut across his forearm already closing, his composure cracked but not entirely gone. He looked at Kalen, who had shifted back as well and was standing in the center of the ruined sanctuary with blood on his face and his chest heaving, and Giovanni made the second careful calculation of the evening. He stepped back, not in defeat exactly, in the way that very smart, very dangerous men step back when they have correctly identified which battles are worth the cost. He straightened, adjusted what remained of his collar, and looked at Alessia with an expression that was not angry and was not warm, and was simply, neutrally, the face of a man releasing a claim. Then he walked through a side door, and he was gone. The cathedral was almost empty now. A few stunned witnesses remained pressed against the far walls. The candles that were still burning threw unsteady light across the debris, and the cracked stone, and the crushed white flowers on the floor. Kaelin turned to face her. He was a mess. There was no other word for it. The cut on his temple was still bleeding slowly, tracking fresh red over the dried dark on his jaw. There was dust in his hair and a bruise forming along his left cheekbone, and he was standing in the middle of a destroyed cathedral in a foreign territory where he had just committed what would technically be described as an international incident. He looked at her, and then Alpha King Kaelin, ruler of the most powerful pack on the continent, a man she had watched dismiss noblewomen and silence councils, and make decisions that moved borders without ever once letting his face show a moment of doubt, drop to his knees. Not one knee, both. Right there in the rubble and the scattered wax and the broken wood. He went down like the weight of everything he had refused to feel for years had finally become too heavy to stand under. His head dropped forward for one moment. Just one. Then he lifted his eyes back to her, and she saw something on his face she had never seen there before in 3 years of watching him. He was terrified. Not of Giovanni. Not of the political fallout waiting for him at home. Not of the faction heads who would be sending furious correspondence by morning. Of her. Of this moment. Of the very real possibility that she would look at him and say no. He tilted his chin up, slowly, deliberately, barring his throat, the oldest submission gesture a wolf could make, the one that said, "I surrender, I yield, I am at your mercy and I know it and I am choosing it anyway." "I was wrong." His voice broke on the last word, not dramatically, just a small fracture, like a thin line in glass. "I was wrong and I was a coward and I told myself I was protecting my friendship and my pack, and every single reason I gave myself was true, and none of them were the real reason." Alessia hadn't moved. "The real reason," he said, "was that you terrified me, not because you were beneath me, because you were the only person I have ever stood near who made me feel like the walls I spent my whole life building were completely pointless. And I didn't know what to do with that, so I did what I always do." He held her gaze. "I shut it out, and I sent you into the dark, and I have been paying for it every second since." She realized her face was wet. She hadn't noticed when the tears had started. They were just there now, moving down her cheeks in the candlelight, and she didn't wipe them away. "There was something else," he said. "Something I only learned 4 days ago." He told her then, quietly and without softening it, about the masked scent, about the 2 years of chemical interference that had blinded his wolf to what she was to him, about the false mate claim that had been manufactured by his enemies to fracture his credibility, about the report that had sat in his spymaster's folder and rewritten everything he thought he understood about the last 3 years. She listened. When he finished, the cathedral was very quiet. "I am not telling you that," he said, "so you will feel sorry for me. I am telling you because you deserve to know the truth, all of it, what was done to both of us." He paused. "But the deception does not excuse what I did to you in that hall. I still chose to hurt you. I still chose the easy thing, and I will live with that whether you forgive me or not." Alessia looked at him kneeling in the wreckage. This man who had never knelt for anyone. This man who had built himself into something so armored and immovable that the entire continent had stopped expecting anything human from him. She thought about the girl who had walked out of a gala into the cold dark and slid down a tree and cried until the feeling went somewhere she couldn't reach it. She thought about the woman who had stood in a borrowed white dress 10 minutes ago with still hands and an empty chest, and told herself this was what surviving looked like. She took a step toward him. Then another. She stopped when she was close enough to see the exact texture of the cut on his temple, the way his jaw was tight with the effort of holding himself together, the slight tremor in his hands where they rested on his knees. "You hurt me," she said. Her voice was steady. She needed it to be steady for this. "Not just at the gala. Every time I walked past you for 3 years and you looked through me like I was part of the furniture. That hurt too. I need you to know that." "I know," he said. "I know that." "And if I choose this," she said, "if I choose you, it is not because I need you to save me. I already saved myself. I left. I survived. I was going to keep surviving." She held his gaze. "I would choose you because I want to, because I decide to, not because I don't have other options." Something moved through his eyes. "That is the only way I would want it," he said. She reached out. Her hand found the side of his face, careful around the cut, her palm resting against his jaw. She felt him exhale, slow and complete, like something that had been braced for impact was finally, carefully standing down. "Get up," she said quietly. He stood. He was so much taller standing. She had always known that. She looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the space between them, which had been filled for 3 years with silence and distance and all the things neither of them had said, was gone. A sound came from the doorway behind them. She turned. Matteo stood at the entrance of the cathedral, in the gap where the doors used to be. He was still and quiet, and his face was doing several things at once, things that were complicated and old and too layered to name quickly. His eyes moved from Alesha to Kaelin and back to Alesha. Nobody spoke. Then Matteo looked at Kaelin with the full weight of 9 years and a broken night, and a sister he had watched cry in a borrowed silver dress. And after a silence that lasted long enough to matter, he gave one single slow nod. Not absolution. Not yet. That would take time and honesty and probably more than one very difficult conversation over something strong to drink. But it was a beginning. Alesha felt Kaelin's hand find hers at her side, his fingers closing around hers slowly, like he was asking permission with the gesture itself. She held on. Outside the broken cathedral, in the dark above Varen, the blood moon was still burning. It did not know or care about the politics it had started, the hearts it had broken open, the long way everyone in that ruined sanctuary had traveled to get here. It just burned. The way truth burns, quietly, completely, without asking anyone's permission. She didn't choose him because she had run out of other choices. She chose him because she had finally, for the first time in her life, decided that what she wanted was something she was allowed to have. And what she wanted was standing right next to her, holding her hand like he was never going to be careless with it again.